Coming up on tonight's Faith versus Culture, living out your faith in the public square. We've got a fascinating conversation with Charlotte Pence Bond coming right up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Charlotte, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. This is great.
All right, so we've got a lot to dig into and to dive into today, but I have to start here. And we've talked about this, you and I, a lot in the past, but I think your story is so unique and interesting for so many reasons. You grew up in a very public family. Obviously, your father, Vice President Mike Pence, he served as vice president, he's served as a governor, he's done a lot of things across the board. What was it like for you growing up in such a public family?
You know, it's interesting. First of all, thanks for having me on. This is so fun to talk again. It's kind of boring. I don't know that it was that weird to me, because when it's all you know, it's just all you know. And I wrote about this a little bit in a book I wrote about my dad, that we kind of, I think my parents really had a normal upbringing for us. I mean, it was kind of like, okay, this is my dad's job. But at the end of the day, there wasn't any, it wasn't that weird. And we were encouraged to go to anything we wanted to go to. Like, we were welcome to go to it, but we didn't have to go to anything. And so, we didn't have to go to any public events if we didn't want to. So it really was just a family thing, that we kind of did together. And I think that kind of continued even into, later on when he was in a much more public, setting.
Yeah, I think so often anybody who grew up in a Christian home, and certainly somebody who grew up in a really prominent home with parents who are believers, it's difficult to make that transition from having faith that's your faith and just having faith kind of because our family is a group of believers. So I wanted to ask, what was your journey to salvation like? What was that process for you to actually take on a faith of your own?
Yeah, so I obviously did grow up in a Christian household. I always really had a personal faith, but in college I did kind of go away from it. Kind of was like, okay, what if I just don't follow all the rules? I don't do all the things you're supposed to do. And I think I always believed in God and Jesus, but I just was I kind of fell away or a little bit. And then I was studying abroad. And when I was coming back from studying abroad, I sort of had, in that time period, a sort of an experience where I just really felt God's presence, and it was very clear to me. And I looked back over this journal I had kept throughout the whole year, and I had noticed that, at times I had written down things that had stuck out to me or been important to me, and maybe they were a Bible verse or a Christian song. And I noticed that all of these times I'd written things down, it seemed like there was this thread that, while I was kind of pushing God away or going away, he was coming after me. And so I had this very weird feeling like I was being accepted back. And it's a hard thing to describe. And so from then on, I really had my faith was very, very real to me. So I think it is important to kind of not just to question your faith, but to ask questions about it, and to, like, we've talked about this. We had a show, Doubting It, which was a podcast, and it was really helpful because it did kind of, at least for me, I kind of saw a trend in our generation that a lot of people would kind of, once they had any pushback to their faith, they would go away from it completely. And so I think that maybe when you can have some of those questions answered early, or at least listened to early on, that can help a lot, so that you don't feel afraid to ask questions about your faith, and then one day have a bunch of questions and then you don't know what to do with those.
Yeah, and that's what you did so well on that podcast, Doubting, is you went through people's stories and talked about their doubts and the things they went through. And we're seeing that a lot with our generation, as you said. But one thing that's so interesting about your family is you've very much so become known as a family that loves Jesus, right? Your faith is at the forefront for all of you. What would you say your parents did that was really effective for you guys growing up, that made it so much easier for you to connect all those dots when you hit that period in your life?
Well, I think they did really encourage us to, have our beliefs be our own, no matter what belief we're talking about. It was, my parents had, an understanding of, we're showing you this is what we believe in various, various ways, various genres, I guess, if that makes sense. And then, but, you have to decide what you believe on your own, but this is what we believe. I think there was, and that was kind of, I don't know, definitely, with other ideas about, culture, beliefs. I think that for the most part, though, we were definitely encouraged to ask questions. We were constantly asking questions, whether it was about current events or if it was about religion. We went to a private school through 8th grade, but then went to public high school. So early, I think that, going to public high school was harder for me than going to college, because it was such a different environment than I was used to and that I was comfortable in. And so even that, having that experience and having my foundation of my family to kind of go back to, was really great. I think that my parents have always lived out their faith. And so that's another thing. I think that when you, no one's perfect, but you have good role models and you can go to people and say, and the idea of not being perfect too. That's part of the Christian message, right? That you're not perfect. It's okay. You don't have to pretend like you are. But I think too, and on that podcast, I think the first episode we did was with Eric Metaxas, and he really convicted me on it. And I've remembered so many times, because we were talking about doubt and having doubts about your faith. And he was like, you're not supposed to doubt forever though. He was like, it's okay to have questions, but there are answers to your questions. And that's actually biblical, that you can find the answers. You're not supposed to live in doubt. And he kind of was saying, doubt is kind of a cool thing, a little bit of I'm a Christian, but I'm not totally sure. Or, I practice this, but anything else could be also true. That's kind of trendy. And he was kind of calling me out on it and saying, this isn't supposed to be like how you live forever. You're supposed to ask questions, but you also get answers. And so I think having a place to go to ask questions, no matter where it is so important for young people, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think the thing to remember as Christians is to know, like you said, it's great to have questions, but then to realize that our God is big enough for those questions. So don't be afraid to take them to him and to other believers, but seek answers. Don't just leave the question unanswered, So. Mm-hmm. And something you mentioned too about your parents having laid a strong foundation of faith. I think that's so critical, particularly in this day and age when people, and particularly young kids, teens, are being pulled in so many different directions. And the thing that comes to mind most readily is like the sexuality issue and the left's push to kind of redefine identity. It seems like identity is at the center of this new sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. I want to ask, as believers, as Christians, how should we see our identity?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think in general, I do think that our identity, obviously, it has to be found in something bigger than, it has to be in something bigger in how Christ sees us, which is an easy thing to say and a really hard thing to do. And I think that there's, we believe as Christians, there's a right way, that we have Christ as someone to go to, with everything. And so I think it's like we were saying earlier about not being perfect, and understanding that you don't need to, go along with certain things. You don't need to, necessarily hide, certain things either, but bringing things to the light, and also, just taking everything to God, I think. And I think that's how we keep going after finding that identity in Christ, and not necessarily in things that are changeable and movable.
Well, Charlotte, we're going to be right back after the break with more. We've got a lot more to talk about here on Faith versus Culture. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture on the CBN News Channel. We are here with Charlotte Pence Bond. Now, Charlotte, I want to dig into something else that really sort of captivated me. You and I were starting to work together during the time on your podcast, during the time that your dad was still in office as vice president. And it was interesting watching you and your family really handle with grace a lot of the things that come along with public life. What is it like to be in that sort of national position where there might be people saying things that are just absolutely fabricated or not true, not only about things that your father or your family believe, but maybe even attributing fake statements to them? What is it like to sort of cope with that?
It's interesting. I think one of the things that kind of comes to mind, I remember one time, I think it was during, it was kind of during, I think it was during my dad's governor race, that there's something happened. And I remember, my mom saying, I'm not going to let what's going on out there affect what's going on in here. Meaning, like, in our family, the outside, whatever's happening isn't going to affect us and our relationship, and our closeness and, trust and like reliance on each other. I think that kind of sums up, I guess, something that I've thought about, whether it's, I don't think things that aren't true have ever bothered me that much, to be honest. And I don't, no, I think that's just, you have to cling to what is true, and what is true. And that goes for everybody. It doesn't matter, if it's a kid at high school who's spreading rumors about you, or if it's on a national stage. I think that for the most part, just kind of clinging to those relationships and the truth of them, and not getting distracted by the outside, I think is something that is important to do.
I think going through a political campaign can be, I'm sure, really refining, right? Because it can reveal a whole lot about the person who's running, and obviously it can reveal things about the people who are surrounded by. So, your dad's family too. So you and your mom and all of that. So there are so many different people who are impacted by a campaign. I want to ask, what did you learn maybe in watching your parents? What did you learn about your parents' character in the process of your dad running for governor, being governor, and then running and being vice president?
Oh, wow. I think I've learned definitely, I don't think this necessarily, I learned this because they were going through this, but just they're so, such a team. They work together so much. I went on the campaign trail with them in 2016. I was working at a camp, and I was living at home after I graduated from college, and then the whole vice president thing happened, which happened very quickly. That is literally like within a couple weeks, basically, you're like in a different mindset. And so I went on the campaign trail with them pretty much the whole time. And so that was really enlightening. I got to see my mom as a as a leader too, as a boss. I mean, she'd been a teacher, she'd been a first lady, she'd done so many things as a congressional spouse, but she'd been my teacher. But seeing her in so many roles and with people, and like there's so many logistical things that you have to do, and so that was really awesome. I think that, I mean, yeah, I think just their faith in general was so evident always, but especially during that time. Just thinking back about how there was no anxiety about anything. Even you kind of know, you're maybe gonna be like considered as the vice president pick, and then we met with the family, and then there's kind of some stages. And my parents tell a story that when they decided to run for Congress in 2000 again, they were out and we were in Colorado, and they saw these two hawks flying, and my dad and my mom were trying to make this decision, and my mom said, well, if we're going to do this again, we're going to do it like these hawks. And they were just letting the wind carry them. And so she said, we're going to do like the two hawks with no flapping. And if God's going to lift us to a position, he's going to do it, but we're not going to flap to get there. And no flapping is like a mantra throughout campaigns. Every staffers learn this story. There's always like a plaque. My mom had a pin, like it's a thing, no flapping. And so I think that I've seen throughout, I mean, always with my parents, is this idea that if God's calling you to something, no matter what it is, it's not necessarily vice president, but whatever you're being called to, just rely on God and don't try to get there by means that are not right.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking about trust there. That's the thing, right? And I think it's so hard in a position like what your family has been in and what a lot of other people are to have that level of trust. And it's amazing that you guys have had that, because we do tend to want to take over and make things happen for ourselves. And I love what you said there about, that we shouldn't do that, that when we do that, we may not actually be going where we're supposed to go. And so really letting God lead us. Now, my last question for you is one that it's sort of in line with what we were talking about before, but this idea of people coming after you. There have been people who obviously, any politician, they're going to come after them really hard. What have you learned about loving enemies? And I can even put enemies in quotes, but loving people who are maybe enemies or who have gone against you. What is politics and being where you are taught you about that form of love?
I think in general with people, kind of remembering that there's so much more to their story. And I guess this kind of goes with seeing them as God sees them, but also when we're talking about identity, right? I think that there's typically so much more going on. And so I think that goes for anything. I mean, that's not just politics. That's whenever there's conflict, there's usually more to the story. And I think that I try to kind of remember that, I guess, and just kind of, whatever it is, think about it that way, and remember that there's a human behind every whatever tweet or something. But there's also a lot of narrative that people might believe, or that people might have had past experiences that they're projecting onto you now. And so I think just being loving to people, not assuming the worst, trying not to assume that they see the worst in you, which can be hard, but just giving people a space to just be safe and be comfortable with you. And that's a way to love them, I think.
Well, Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time and just sharing your journey. You've had an incredible journey, and we appreciate you taking us through it today.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys. This is great.
Everyone else will be back after the break with a little bit more of Faith versus Culture. We're back with more Faith versus Culture on the CBN News Channel, and you were just watching Charlotte Pence Bond. Tré, what did you think?
Look, I think anytime anybody, like I asked her, having grown up in a Christian home, it's difficult to kind of separate your parents' faith and the faith that you inherited, and find your own faith. And I think that there's probably even, not that it's more difficult or better or worse, it just is different. When you grow up in a prominent family, that's an additional layer. So, there are expectations put on you that might not be put on somebody who's not well known. So it's always interesting to hear somebody's story in a position like Charlotte was in. So I just thought it was a fascinating conversation and a great topic to discuss.
Yeah, and I think, for me, the big takeaway at the end that I really loved was when she talked about you don't really know where people are coming from, what their story is, and seeing people through the lens of God, right? That when we're attacked or we go through things or somebody's tweeting us nasty from an egg account, saying something horrific to us, rather than reacting in a very negative way, having that love, Jesus is pretty clear on this. You're supposed to love your enemies, clothe them, feed them, not mean tweet back at them, right? And we all fall short, but I thought having somebody in that position whose own father and family has been trashed and tarnished like any politician is, walk away with that perspective, I found that to be really helpful.
Yeah. And, something else that I thought was really impactful is the no flapping mantra that her family adopted over the years. I thought that was it's so simple, but it's so poignant, because I think so often we think, well, I just need to do this. And if I do more, if I had done this, it would have turned out differently. And look, Scripture says that we should be hardworking and that we should, be obedient to doing what God has called us to. But we also shouldn't just be aimlessly walking around seeking out God's will. We can find it just by going to him in prayer, by studying Scripture, and we can know that God's will is just us honoring God wherever he's placed us. So we don't have to do the work of figuring out where we belong. God will handle that for us.
That is an amazing way to end that portion of the conversation, and we will be back in just a moment to close out Faith versus Culture.
So that is all the time we have on today's episode of Faith versus Culture on the CBN News Channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a blessed week.